Cheers and salutations. Welcome one and all to Americans Learn. My name is Kit. Please be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe and hit that ring bell notification. That way all of you are made aware we upload new content upon our YouTube channel. And today, we're talking with Eastory, U.S. Foreign Wars, 1950 to 2019, fighting the last war. So let's find out what's going on. So listen, folks, for all the channels that we check out here for Americans Learn, there's a lot of great channels that do information and stuff to help us expand our minds. So here's what I'm going to ask all you hip, cool cats. Please do the right thing. Support the original content creator. That link is in the description box below. So as a favor for me, please do the right thing and support the original content creators. But without further ado, since I'm in charge of the ones and twos, let's get ready to play this video in a 3, a 2, a 1.
Thanks to Great Causes Plus for sponsoring this video. In 1975, the communists took over South Vietnam and the Vietnam War ended as a failure for the United States. But how could this have happened? The US had done everything right. It had meticulously studied the previous war in Korea and had accordingly built up its strategy in Vietnam. Yet the wars in Vietnam and Korea were too different for the same strategies to work in both. Like the war in Vietnam, all other US foreign wars were to some extent conducted based on the conclusions made from the previous conflict.
Look at that. Korea, fight like World War II. In Vietnam, fight like in Korea. In Gulf War, fight like in Vietnam. And with the Iraq War, for those you may not know, I actually did 2 tours in Iraq. Fight like in the Gulf War, I guess. I guess so. History just learn from the lessons of the past, but hey, you got to improve yourselves.
Sometimes these conclusions were correct, but other times they were not. Join us as we will look into 5 US foreign wars and examine how lessons learned from the earlier conflicts influenced the later ones. The US had designed a foolproof war plan during the Second World War. Say on a different...
Well, I like the imagery of the U.S. soldiers defeating the Third Reich and Adolf Hitler and his Nazi thugs, so very good.
Continent, a powerful dictator is on a rampage. With the US Navy in control of the oceans, America has no problem sending troops to invade the enemy. The enemy may attempt to resist with determination, but the Americans have something on their side that no other nation can match.
Patriotism.
Money.
Yeah.
The US is the richest country in the world, and it can afford more of the best military gear than any other nation. Whatever the cause of the particular war, the US superiority in arms, tanks and planes will eventually grind the enemy down and make him surrender. After victory in World War II,
Achtung und surrender.
the US began opposing the spread of communism in the Cold War. In 1950, Communist North Korea launched an invasion of South Korea. The US came to South Korea's aid.
Okay, I like that the Freedommobile is just the Batmobile, the tumbler, just painted, just red, white, and blue. Nice touch there. I love it. Epic. Epic Freedommobile.
As expected, North Korea's army was far less capable than the US military, and the US forces carried the war into North Korea. Not wanting to see North Korea defeated, Communist China sent its army against the US forces. The Chinese ambushed the US troops and pushed them back into South Korea. The US was now faced with Communist China, backed by the Soviet Union. The Korean peninsula was packed with troops to such an extent that it was very hard to go on an offensive there. The US could use its superior air force and navy to swing the war in its favor. In order to do that, they had to attack targets in China or the Soviet Union.
Oh no.
But this had the danger of quickly turning the Korean War into a world war, and the US did not risk that. The war on the peninsula itself lasted for 2 more years without bringing advantage to either side. Eventually it was decided to end the war and accept the division of Korea into 2. Korean War was over, but soon another conflict flared up in the region. The North Vietnamese communists launched a guerrilla campaign against the capitalist government of South Vietnam. Soon the situation in South Vietnam had grown so dire, the US had to send its forces to intervene.
Freedom is under threat. Well, stay with me, folks. What could possibly go wrong with us intervening there?
The problem was that the policies of the South Vietnamese government were unpopular among its people, and they began to look for North Vietnamese communists to take over. The US military, due to not being the South Vietnamese government, was unable to change these policies and get the people to change their minds. So the only option left was to take them out. The situations in Korea and Vietnam were somewhat similar. The Vietnamese communist guerrillas would probably not be a match for the US forces, but the main danger lay in...
I like how they had the Chad and the Virgin. Okay, so there you go.
The communist China feeling threatened and sending its military into South Vietnam. Just as in Korea, it would once again turn the war into a bloody stalemate. The US felt it could not go immediately all in Vietnam. Otherwise, China might become suspicious. It deployed its forces in a limited manner and gradually escalated from weaker tactics to much stronger ones to stay under China's radar. With the threat of the Chinese invasion taken care of, the US was opposed only by the Vietnamese communists. On paper, they were much weaker than the US forces.
It was a mistake. Ay, ay, ay. So much madness. My own father served in Nam. I never had a chance to know him. He passed away before I was born. But he only talked about it once to my mom. And that was it. One time.
But was this really the case? The US Army had much more advanced equipment, but it was not made to fight in the jungle, and its efficiency was limited. The US Army was trained for a conventional war, not for fighting a counterinsurgency campaign, and this further lessened its prowess. Thirdly, as the US slowly escalated the war, the Vietnamese communists had the time to learn the US tactics and come up with effective countermeasures. The strength difference between the two forces ended up not so large. As a result, the US was unable to destroy the communist guerrillas as quickly as it hoped. The war dragged on and on. The US government had originally promised that the war would be a short one. But this had not happened. The people became suspicious. Soon, the US government's policy in Vietnam was more and more disapproved. As the approval of US politicians began to suffer...
I liked how there's comparison. YouTube Rewind. 16,000 dislikes. Hey, I remember YouTube Rewind used to be a thing.
They ordered to pull US troops out of Vietnam. Some years later, South Vietnam fell to the communists. If only the US government had seen Richard Baum's video course The Fall and Rise of China from the Great Courses Plus, they might have done much better in Vietnam. Of course, they would have needed a time machine to see it, but we don't. This year I want to produce more content, and to help with that I took a course by Tyler J. Mazzeo on writing creative non-fiction. With no formal education in writing, I had difficulties making scripts. But the fundamentals gained from the course has sped up my writing, which will result in more videos. The Great Courses Plus is like the Netflix of learning. You can choose from 11,000 courses ranging from modern history, investing and cooking, all the way to the intricacies that apparently go into looking at the sky. Like why is it blue, or what kind of details to look for in different clouds. Take your skill of talking about the weather to the next level. But Eastory you can learn as well by watching videos on YouTube, I hear you say. You sure do, conveniently observant viewer. But the Great Courses Plus videos are better structured, and its content of a more consistent quality, which will save you on time. And it is taught by professionals. And like YouTube, you can check it out.
You know, here's the thing. This is a sponsor, and I don't know if the link is still good. It probably could be. But nonetheless, this is why I tell everyone, please support the original content creator. Here's the thing. Eastory, don't sell yourself short. You're doing yourself a fantastic job in breaking down very complex historical events and giving us a nice, short, animated, hilarious, but informative rundown. So, yes, he's a professional. I encourage everyone to listen to the professionals. But, Eastory, come on. Don't put that not professional stuff in there. You're doing A-okay.
For free. To get the free trial, visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/Eastory or click on the link in the description below. Now back to the video. After Vietnam, the US was much more careful, and its most famous foreign intervention from the following decade was sending John Rambo on a secret mission to Afghanistan. However, in 1990, another conflict sprang up in the Middle East. Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein ordered his troops to occupy a small but oil-rich country of Kuwait. It was necessary to liberate the people of Kuwait. and their considerable oil deposits.
Freedom!
Before engaging in the conflict, the US had to make sure it would avoid the mistakes made in Vietnam. The Iraqi army was a conventional force, just what the US forces were prepared to fight. The battlefield was a desert, an ideal terrain for the US Air Force to destroy the enemy's army. At that time, the Cold War was about to end. The Soviet Union was flooded with its own problems and was unwilling to intervene in Iraq. So the US abandoned the cautious approach. There would be no delays and long negotiations, and the US would drop everything it had on the enemy from the start. The Gulf War could proceed. The US Air Force crippled the Iraqi army from the air, and following that, the US ground forces easily secured Kuwait. With Saddam's forces defeated, the Iraqi people rose up against him. The US could seize the opportunity and send its forces to depose Saddam. However, there was another lesson they had learned from Vietnam. The US military was good at destroying things, but it was less good at tasks such as uniting the people of a country under one government. If it would intervene in Iraq, there was the danger that its forces could end up in the same quagmire they once had in Vietnam. The US troops went home, and Saddam's regime in Iraq survived. In 2001, the US was attacked by the Islamic radicals and the country declared war on terror. But how do you fight an abstract concept like threats of violent action for political purposes? By attacking the ideology behind it. You see, after the end of the Cold War, many of the countries freed from communist dictatorship had turned into prosperous democracies, and US's allies.
I like how everyone's just happy. They got money. Everyone's dancing around. Okay, all right. Everyone's happy. At least the old buildings are still there.
Perhaps the same scenario could be repeated in the Middle East. Saddam's dictatorship still ruled Iraq. If the US would topple him, Iraq would become democratic. With the US's help, it would become an example of freedom and prosperity, which would guide the people of the Middle East away from radicalism.
And that's the end of the video, folks. That's how it all turned out. Nothing to worry about. Oh, wait. That's not what happened.
And authoritarianism. This would expand democracy and greatly reduce the appeal of terrorism. And so the US set out to bring freedom to Iraq. And also Afghanistan. But in this video we will only concentrate on the war in Iraq.
Okay.
Initially, all went well. The Iraqi forces were easily defeated. The US took down Saddam's government and the people rejoiced. But then instead of building a harmonious democratic state, the Iraqi people divided themselves into factions and started fighting for power. Soon the country descended into a civil war with the US troops caught in the middle. In the chaos, the Islamic radicals began to grow their influence. The US could not pull out the troops. If it did, Iraq would have collapsed into complete chaos, and in the worst case, the radicals could take over large parts of the country and launch further attacks on the US. From year to year, America had to spend much to have its military keep Iraq in a stable state. The costs moved up as the US forces concentrated on
2004 to 2008. That's how long I served.
extinguishing the civil war. This was met with success, and in the following years they were able to scale down their presence in Iraq until most of the US troops had left the country. The US ended up spending huge amounts of resources on the Iraq war and gained very little from it. But the Iraq saga was far from over. In 2011, Iraq's neighbor Syria imploded into a civil war. The Islamic radicals gained influence and established a faction known as the Islamic State. Soon they captured large territories in Iraq and Syria. Once again, the US had to return to Iraq. If the US would repeat the strategy from the last war, that is, sweeping in with its military and trying again to build democracy in the liberated areas, then it could very well end up in another $1 trillion mission to stabilize Iraq. This time, the freedom manuals were left home and another strategy was chosen. The Islamic State was surrounded by factions that were hostile to it, but they were too weak to go on the offensive on their own. The US Army would train the local troops into a good fighting force and
what could possibly go wrong? You got Chuck Norris there. Chuck Norris. Listen, man. I heard in his beard he's got another fist.
supply them with weapons. At the same time, the US Air Force would support the offensive against the Islamic State from the air. The US would give support only to those factions that were on its friend list. So, after the Islamic State was defeated, the region would end up under the control of the US's allies. The strategy worked. Although it took several years, the local forces went on an offensive, pushed the Islamic State back, and took over all of its territory. And the US Army gave them only mostly indirect support. But you know who got more than just indirect support? The US opponents in Syria, America's rivals Russia and Iran, had sent their troops to help the Syrian government. They were able to overpower the US allies in Syria, and all of Syria and Iraq did not end up controlled by the US allies. So this too did not turn out to be a perfect approach. But this is where the video ends. In the next one, we will see how the US defeated Germany in World War II. If you like what you see, you can join the supporters of this channel on Patreon, or check out the Great Courses Plus trial via the link in the description. See you next time.
Well, there's a few things to take away from this. First of all, I can't help but think of the old quote from Fallout: war never changes. That's the one thing that didn't change. And unfortunately, it seems to me, especially as we are ending 2023, that we are still stuck. By the way, I'm recording this on Christmas Day, by the way, so that's why I'm saying 2023. We're stuck in this grim, dark path of madness, insanity, and destruction. So eventually there might be a day when we could have peace someday, understanding, but war is intertwined with humans, our civilizations, and so much more. And there's a lot to learn from this, especially how we've learned from mistakes and make new ones or keep on repeating them over and over again. Nothing goes as planned. Nothing ever ends. And while things do change, eventually it becomes the way it is, until eventually it changes too, and it becomes the new norm, etc., and infinitum. But the one thing I do want all of you to do is please have a safe and happy new year, and may 2024 be a successful year for all of you. Peace to you all.